Always a pleasure to see you. I want to put it to you, Ben, that we saw the, frankly, I think, nationally humiliating sight today of Rishi Sunak going to Dubai and signing a cheque for £1.6 billion and then being relegated to the back row of a photograph. Rishi no mates, couldn't even buy some friends in Dubai for £1.6 billion. And how do you think it will go down with people at the moment who are struggling to pay their own utility bills, seeing so much money being given to global schemes abroad in places like Dubai?
Well, you know, if you ask, just going back to the poll that you quoted, Martin, if you ask people simply, would you like to reduce carbon emissions because we believe that carbon emissions are damaging the climate, there can only be one answer. And you kind of indicated that the vast majority of people would say, yeah, absolutely, reduce carbon emissions. But then if you were to tell them that the cost of doing so to achieve net zero by 2050, by the Treasury's own initial estimates, was £1.4 trillion. That's 50 odd billion pounds a year. And that it would be one of the most inflationary economic policies a government could implement, in that you would have to insulate all your homes. 80% of commercial property in the United Kingdom doesn't comply with the net zero targets. You'd have to get rid of your internal combustion engine car and buy a really expensive electric car. You would have to change your perfectly good gas boiler. And by the way, gas was on the verge of being classified as a green fuel just before the pandemic kicked off. You'd have to give up your perfectly good gas boiler and put in an ineffective, noisy heat exchanger. And all of this would be a massive burden on the British taxpayer. And even if you did all of that, actually you'd be making close to no impact on the climate for the globe, because the United Kingdom produces less than 1% of carbon emissions. So the question that people need to be asked, and they need to answer, is, are they prepared to economically emasculate the United Kingdom in order to deliver this ideological result by 2050? I mean, and by the way, if 2050, how do they get to 2050? Maybe it should be 2040. And if 2050 isn't right, perhaps it should be 2060. The whole thing is kind of arbitrary. We've just decided ideologically that this is the direction in which the developed world will go. And the developed world, remember, produces much less carbon emissions than the developing world. And the other thing that I failed to mention, which I will just mention now, is that in order to hit some of these targets, what we're doing is offshoring our carbon footprint. So we're just exporting to China jobs, manufacturing, and other economic parts of the United Kingdom in the false hope that we can somehow tick the net zero boxes. But, you know, offshoring your carbon emissions doesn't reduce carbon emissions. It merely offshores it. And indeed, you mentioned the ULEZ charge that Sadiq Khan has introduced across London. That doesn't reduce carbon emissions. When you pay £12.50 to drive your car, which doesn't comply with his legislation, that doesn't mean there's going to be fewer carbon emissions. It just means you're £12.50 worse off. You're still producing the same amount of carbon emissions. The whole thing has been missold to the British public. In fact, it hasn't even been sold to the British public, because it's just been implemented over the British public's head. And now slowly the cost of net zero is beginning to reveal itself. And what we need is for a proper cost-benefit analysis to be produced, something the Conservatives don't like doing. You know, I'm going to digress again for a second, if I may, Martin, but you'll recall the hassle Liz Truss was given when she wanted to cut taxes on the working class because the OBR hadn't costed it, hadn't looked at the impact of her tax cuts on the British economy. Well, where's the OBR on net zero? Has anyone done the kind of calculation required to determine whether that's going to damage the economy in the way that I've been setting out? We do know the Treasury has estimated its cost to be 1.4 trillion. That's 70% of our national debt, again, in order to hit net zero. And that's the Treasury's estimate. When was the Treasury last time on correct on a number? It's never right. So if they say 1.4 trillion, it's probably going to be more like double that. So we'll see our national debt skyrocket. We'll see our economy collapse. We'll have embedded inflation. And the way we'll hit net zero is by exporting all our manufacturing and other carbon producing industries to China. The whole thing is a farce. What we should do is just ditch the drive to net zero in the United Kingdom. It's not a matter of, you know, moving the deadline for internal combustion engines and gas boilers from 2030 to 2035. It's a matter of completely unwinding this inexorable march, not to net zero, but economic emasculation.
OK, Ben Habib, wow, you are certainly fully charged. Thank you for joining us on the show. Ben Habib, Deputy Leader of Reform UK. Fantastic stuff.